Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for bearing with me for that a bit of glitch and issue with technology. So I'm Durley. I'm a senior lecturer in urban planning. And also the assistant in diversity and inclusion here in the faculty. So I would like to start again today's session in acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I am and we are zooming in today. So for me, it would be the Wiradjuri Wailwan people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the lands and waterways in the area where I now live, which is in Moreland, and I pay respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging. And I also would like to acknowledge all First Nations elders and who are here in the meeting today. Thank you. And so just to give a background and structure for this session. So the focus of this session is really on the Indigenous Cultural Design Competency Curriculum, which Jefa, along with traditional owners, have designed, co-designed, co-produced. And so the idea of the ICDC is to introduce this Indigenous perspectives and practices to ABP staff. And so Jefa, as a structure for the session, I would like to invite Jefa to provide a background about the ICDC and the story behind it, and also probably encourage everyone who has not completed to complete it. And I have also invited a few individuals who could reflect on the ICDC. So I've invited Simon, Elaine, Hao, Paris. Did I miss anyone? Hao, Paris, Elaine, Simon. Yeah. To reflect on the ICDC, and I have purposely invited individuals who have different roles within the faculty to see it from their perspective. And then later on, we'll have a more interactive session for anyone within the group to kind of also share their own reflections in terms of what they thought about the ICDC and how does it influence, or how do they engage with the ICDC and how does it influence their own practice? Yeah. Okay. And if you have questions, please feel free to just raise your hand. I'll try as best as I could to have a look on those raised hands and I'll call you. Yeah. Okay. Any questions at this point?
Oh, God.
Okay. Yeah. So Jefa. Please.
Okay. I'll share screen firstly. Let's see. Okay, good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly sort of fly through a series of slides which really sort of contextualize the backstory of the ICDC and really sort of reinforce the why it's sort of come into being, and then just give you a very quick sort of synopsis of how it's sort of structured and the process in the realization of it. So Yama, or welcome, as we'll say on our country. So certainly it's always important to acknowledge where we are, and I'm located on the unceded sovereign lands of the Kulin Nation. And so, in sort of acknowledging traditional owners, it's always important to note that I'm actually off country. So my mob's Wailwan Kamilaroi country, which is northwest New South Wales, which straddles the Queensland border, about 2.5 hours north of Sydney. And so this project was co-designed and engaged very closely with 4 traditional owner groups. And so certainly pay respect to the elders and knowledge keepers who worked in collaboration on this project. And importantly too, as we know, any university is essentially a destination which represents a diaspora of Indigenous peoples. And so understanding that context is important, because in some respects we need to sort of broaden the frame of reference, but anchoring in a connection to country, in this instance, particularly Kulin Nation. So as best as we can determine, there's only ever been 3 Indigenous people who have graduated from the master's program at the University of Melbourne, ABP, as best as I can determine. And as I understand, there's certainly less than 10 students currently enrolled in the program. And I guess in some respects, the ambition behind this whole initiative is to become a destination and a leader in terms of how we, anchor and connect to this place and how we start to think about our role and contribution. And there is certainly a shift in emphasis and focus and intent. And a lot of that really stems from my role, which started in 2017. But what we're also seeing in parallel is a changing conversation within the built environment disciplines. So we're seeing a visual and visible presence of Indigenous contributors to the built environment, which seek to tell and reveal layers of history and memory. And so practitioners are certainly grappling with how to do this, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And so how we start to engage with this is part of thinking about and resetting design education. And so certainly I think the creative disciplines of the built environment and artists as well can essentially hold a mirror up to society to challenge some of the standard tropes, stereotypes, and sort of ways in which we've framed Indigenous culture and how we start to particularly move beyond a sort of deficit discourse. And I think it's by no accident in the Victorian context that there is a real appetite. So we have legislated for treaty conversation. We have created the first People's Assembly. We have recently announced a Truth and Justice Commission. So there is a fermentation and a real strong focus within our progressive state, which will invariably ripple out beyond this particular jurisdiction. But what we're also seeing in parallel is all of the peak design bodies really seeking to engage. So whether it's the Institute of Architects creating a First Nations advisory group and cultural reference panel, of which I'm a member, whether it's the PIA responding to the Uluru Statement for the Heart, or AILA creating a RAP. But also, what we're also seeing strongly is this sense that the academia and design education is now challenging how we start to think and engage with history and with how architecture and the built environment discipline has actually been an enabler for the colonial project. And we're also seeing within policy and through government a shift in focus to really strengthen this idea of connecting and designing with country. So the need is there, and we need to respond to this in design education, and the ICDC is in some respects the foundational piece to enable it. And so we're certainly seeing in recent times, and it was very evident last year, particularly on the back of the Black Lives Matter movement, that this idea of a reckoning of history is now becoming much more acute, and it provides an opportunity. But in some respects, the faculty has actually been ahead of the curve. So this was a symposium that I convened in 2018, and certainly it demonstrated a real keenness and appetite and thirst and hunger to engage with Indigenous knowledge systems. Similarly, another exhibition which I curated at the Korea Heritage Trust very much sort of focus on this idea of the importance and the contribution of Indigenous voice and agency in design practice. And last week, or actually it's a week and a half ago now, I co-curated the Venice Architecture Biennale with Tristan Wong, and our focus was this notion of in between, really interrogating the space between some of the challenges and shared experiences within our region, how we engage with Indigenous perspective through design practice. And so it very much suggests that we're at a tipping point. And so that's really important in terms of how we start to think about design education as capturing this sort of zeitgeist moment and to engage and create the space and time to have these meaningful conversations. And another initiative which has sort of been running parallel to this sort of changing conversation is the International Indigenous Design Charter, which I was a co-author for, because what it really started to do is look at culturally responsive design practice and creating protocols and methodologies to support the profession in how one goes about it. And I think certainly the fact that Indigenous Architecture and Design Victoria, the only peak design body representing Indigenous practitioners in the country, is turned 10 years old last year in November. And I think certainly the contribution of Indigenous peoples in that movement and that sort of advocacy body has been instrumental in shifting the dial around how we start to engage with notions of Indigenous design. And over the past decade or so, certainly there have been numerous design studios which have engaged with Indigenous considerations on country, creating bespoke design opportunities for students to engage with the layers of history and memory of place and how one starts to embed Indigenous perspectives, particularly with studios which have engaged directly with traditional owners, elders and knowledge keepers. And certainly if the number of sort of public speaking events that I do in a given year is any indication, and it's somewhere in the order of 50 or 60 a year, is any indication, there is a huge desire to really start to unpack what this means for the profession. Equally, there have been numerous publications in recent times which are really starting to engage with the notions of how we start to intersect with design education and how we can start to infuse Indigenous perspectives in that endeavour. And certainly the number of events across the country which engage directly with these thematics, and also very strongly starting to ramp up internationally as well, is certainly reinforcing some of these considerations. And I think this quotation here kind of sums it up quite neatly from the Indigenous Placemaking Council. If nothing of your culture, history, language or art is visible in the streets, parks and buildings where you live, how can you ever feel welcome there? And I guess that's a call to action to really start to interrogate the philosophical and ethical responsibilities of design educators to contribute in starting to build what I call design equity. So this all stemmed from my role as lecturer in Indigenous curriculum development. And what I realised very early in the piece was we needed some foundational work to really support academics and staff to build their own cultural intelligence and to have a mechanism to really sort of engage and also to build resources, capability and the language to navigate some of the complexities and sensitivities of embedding Indigenous content perspectives and knowledge systems within people's subject expertise. And the way in which this was sort of orchestrated was to look at a number of different initiatives to really support this. So building capacity internally through resources in the library, starting to strengthen partnerships and relationality, particularly with traditional owner groups and through research, building cultural visibility by celebrating First Nations contributions, and also obviously looking in the fine grained detail around how one orchestrates an intent of decolonising or indigenising the curriculum. But the starting premise was really, how do we start to create cultural competency? And so that's the main focus of the Indigenous Cultural Competency e-learning module, was to really start to look at how do we find a mechanism whereby one can start to understand and navigate some of the sensitivities and ethical considerations, and how one can start to embed that And we know, through any sort of induction processes through the university, sometimes it's very dense and heavy in terms of content around text, but we are a design faculty. So we wanted to celebrate design, we wanted to celebrate culture, and we wanted to look at the intersection points of how one starts to build cultural intelligence through that endeavour. But we wanted it to be a counterpoint to the way in which these sort of propositions are delivered. And so the way in which we orchestrated this was we engaged directly with 4 traditional owner groups. And that, I guess, provided the cultural imprimatur to proceed, but also the cultural authenticity. We also reached out to the senior Indigenous leadership of the university, from Chancellery all the way through. And it was very strongly aligned to this notion of not about us, without us. So this Indigenous-led approach. And it was over 2.5 years in the making. And it was very much defined as a bespoke, carefully calibrated and structured interface to really be engaging and to embed content which was not only visual, but dense in sort of research, but also looking at using imagery, hearing voices, having digital content. And it was based on a series of pillars. And the pillars was really a way to sort of break it down elementally, so people don't become sort of overwhelmed by the sort of the depth and the content embedded within. And so the realization of the Indigenous Cultural Design Competency e-learning platform is really a way to sort of step through processes and considerations. So as one, particularly if you've never interfaced with Indigenous culture, you have a starting point, and you start to enable one to sort of engage with a number of different dimensions. And these 4 pillars in which it was framed through, and these sort of different lenses, was really instrumental. And so the first one was really around sort of anchoring and connecting to country. And so we know in the Australian context, there pre-contact, there was over 270 distinct language groups and 600 dialects. So that really sort of talks to that diversity and multiplicity rather than a sort of homogenous, monolithic approach to anchoring in country and place. Pillar 2 was really wanting to delve deep and understanding that the layers of history and memory have an impact to this very day. So how do we start to give voice and make the invisible visible? Pillar 3 was really looking at this notion of art and artifact. So starting to understand that cultural expression, however it's manifested, be it through art or architecture, interior design, landscape design, urban design, is certainly important in terms of the process, but also not privileging the artifact over the journey and the process of how we get there, but also understanding and acknowledging that we're creating new artifacts through built form outcomes. And so why are we doing this? Ultimately, it's about connecting to people, but also by engaging with people, we start to engage with story and narrative and a range of other different dimensions. So there's a real sort of depth in thinking in terms of how we essentially choreograph the experience as one steps through the ICDC. And so certainly the actual visual interface and the way in which it was organised was to be intuitive, engaging, visually compelling, as a way of sort of stepping through the various areas and sort of learning hooks, if you like. Importantly too, what we wanted to do was it to be bi-directional. So yes, we're providing content and it's certainly designed to be iterative, so it's going to evolve and change over time. Noting already that there are a number of elements which will need to be updated. Things are moving very fast within this space. Certainly the Black Lives Matter movement has really crystallized a number of ideas which are shifting, and so some of that content will certainly need to be brought up to speed. But again, you can see this idea of taking people on a journey and then starting to engage as one embeds into each of the individual pillars a number of other dimensions. So here we're talking things like acknowledging diversity, notions of caring for country or sustainability, looking at some of the policy parameters. And similarly, if we look at the living in history, history and memory pillar, looking at some of the sort of frameworks, looking at the sort of holistic approach and some of the cultural considerations. And then if we sort of move to pillar 3, starting to look at notions of what we mean by art as a sort of a catch-all for cultural expression, looking at notions of identity and commodification of culture through the built environment, looking at this idea of creating new artifacts and process and building as an artifact. And then this idea of really looking at Indigenous practitioners, the interface with the colonial project, how one starts to empower and some of the contributions of institutions as well. So you can see there's quite a lot of information, each are broken down elementally in these sort of 20-minute pillars, so it becomes digestible. And certainly this idea of engaging the senses was another important ingredient. So you do hear from elders and important Indigenous figures. You do see imagery, you do see other content, and there's certainly this idea of translating the sort of inputs and the experience into meaningful action. So there are a number of prompts and learning hooks to engage in that sort of bi-directional way. So certainly, just in terms of pragmatics, the way in which it's organised is best, and optimized through Google Chrome. You need to enable sound, and it's important to complete all the tasks, including the audio content, to enable you actually to move to the next phase. So hopefully that's given you a real sort of quick snapshot of some of the ambition behind the ICDC, but also some of the backstory of how it sort of came into being. Mariana, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jefa, for providing us with that very comprehensive information about the ICDC as well as its content and how it's evolved. So that's really great. And also just wanted to add that while you are reflecting, you could actually send it to yourself. So email it to you so that you'll have a documentation of your answer. So that was really very helpful. Okay, so now I would like to invite reflections from the group. So I'm just removing the pin. So now I would like to invite Paris, Hao, Simon, and Elaine to share their reflections on one of or a few of those pillars covered in the ICDC. We could probably start with Paris.
Thanks, Dirlie, for inviting me to speak briefly at this session, and thanks so much to Jefa for sharing that great background on the ICDC. I am a white settler academic speaking from unceded lands of Wurundjeri Wailwan people of the Kulin Nation, where I've lived and worked for almost 10 years. I grew up not so far away on unceded lands of the Wathaurong people in Geelong. And while I haven't been involved in developing curricula, I've been lucky to tutor in subjects in geography and urban planning at the University of Melbourne that do critically engage with environmental knowledges and the geographies and politics of environmental management and urban planning. For example, on the construction of wilderness ideas, the problem of land rights, recognising urban spaces as country, traditional ecological knowledge and stewardship, and Indigenous communities as key stakeholders in the context of climate change and the outcomes of colonial capitalist institutions, and engaging with this concept of climate justice and what that means if we think about Indigenous perspectives. So the ICDC course, besides being so engaging and visually quite stunning, what stood out for me was the importance of oral history and Indigenous cultures, and in parallel the opportunity and importance of learning by listening to Indigenous people speak to their knowledge and experience. And Judy Bush talked a bit about this yesterday in her course she's involved or tried to include Indigenous voices in a virtual way. So linking to panels and other kind of audio and so on, which has been really valuable in our courses. The second thing that stood out for me was how the course periodically kind of initiated a pause, which was an interesting way of kind of sitting with the material and being challenged to engage with it more tangibly, thinking about, you know, what you will do with this knowledge in how you'll think about your teaching going forward. And certainly it was a great reminder in terms of putting this in your diary to think about putting it into practice and acting on it, which isn't as easy as kind of absorbing the learnings. I also wanted to mention, as a tutor, we often have to facilitate discussion and peer learning around environmental politics in cities, and these are often contested issues. And I think it's super important that we have and develop the confidence to speak to these issues around acknowledging Indigenous connection to country, the validity of different ways of knowing, and implications for climate action. And I think, at least in my experience in the early days of tutoring, sometimes you have to intervene when a student might voice an offensive remark coming from a place of ignorance. And I think learning appropriate terminology and language, being able to dispel harmful myths is really important. So I think this course is a great step and valuable resource that I think is critical for the professional development of casual staff, especially as we are very close to the students in the day-to-day teaching. Finally, as a postdoc on a fixed-term research contract, I've been thinking about how cultural competency can be more formally part of the process of joining a faculty and research hub. As Jefa said, this is a destination, so often researchers are coming from different places and they might not know so much about Australia and the history of this place. And I think this brings up practical questions around allocating time in the working week for this learning, making that kind of like a valid thing to spend time on, even if it doesn't necessarily fit within the strict boundaries of our projects effectively. And it also relates to the wider question of our responsibility as settler academics in a place, our responsibility to a place, particularly for an institution like the Connected Cities Lab, where I am working from, which has an explicitly international viewpoint. So thinking about responsibility to local stakeholders, building solidarity, linking that to international perspectives as well. And I think, I don't have the answers to those questions, but yes, thinking about how to meaningfully engage with First Nations peoples and amplify and make space for diverse voices in the context of very project-based work, I think is something I'm keen to think more about and hear about at higher levels. But those are my key reflections. So thanks very much for having me.
Thanks, Paris, for that very insightful sharing. I was just wondering, Jefa, would you want to respond, or would you want to respond later on after all the speakers have spoken? Reflectors have spoken.
Yeah, I think it might be easy if we just keep the momentum up and have a conversation afterwards.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, thanks, Paris. I think what stood out for me was the confidence, the validity of different ways of knowing, and the suggestions that you have provided. Thanks for that. May we call on Hao? How do you want to share your thoughts?
Okay, thank you, Debbie, for inviting. By going through the module, I felt that it offers quite very considerable breadth and depth in regard to I think, culture and historical information. I think it helps me to learn and to develop some competencies about Aboriginal history and culture to build some general contextual knowledge of some direct and indirect relevance to, I think it's a range of my academic activities. So I think that those several items that stands out. The first thing is about the concept of value. I think it's multidimensional, and it focuses on. I think it brings out some of the, I think it's the underpinning sophistications of the concept of value in relation to both natural and social rights and obligations. So I think they're fascinating topics. Lovely to sort of, especially sort of incentivize me to to think a bit deeper and in relation to its implications. I think the course also inspired me to think about the process of the development in relation to the human usage and allocation of resources, which leads to, I guess, some economic terms such as profit and incentives. They are thought to motivate, I guess, for example, developers or some development companies or corporations or investors to motivate them to alter the environment. But we think it's also important to remind decision makers that there will be consequences, and then we'll have to bear it in a responsible way. So I guess that probably reminds me about this socially, environmentally, and also behaviorally responsiveness to this cultural heritage. So it's really lovely to look into that. I appreciate this essential. I guess my feeling is it's about this essential historical continuity and accumulation of knowledge coming from different sources with different trajectories and also obviously with a lot of competitions, but eventually how to bring those things together. So it's a very, very nice platform. Enjoy going through it. I think the module offers very valuable sort of opportunities to some of my teaching and research activities. If I focus on teaching, it relates particularly to the valuation of land and buildings. It relates to property development processes, I guess the appraisal and the actual practice in dealing with land conversions. I think the module has some direct relevance to the operational phase of managing the built environment. I think that is from a properties perspective, from a planning or landscape management perspective, it is about resource management. So that informs us to develop a more sophisticated approach in dealing with resource management. I guess in the city sense, it's probably how to deal with building management and those things. Some of my colleagues are developing discovery subjects first year, trying to incorporate some of that, those type of contents to bring some contextualized knowledge to first year Bachelor of Design students. So I think that would be lovely. Just probably give you a few examples at postgrad and undergrad levels. I think Paris mentioned about the international perspectives in one of the postgrad subjects. It's called Advanced Property Analysis. We used to run a lecture to tell the experience and stories about three international, three contexts. So the first one is in the US, the Alaska sort of case, where the indigenous and the oil companies have some interesting interactions. The second is obviously in in Australia, obviously the responsible use of resources and land, the Aborigine and resource companies interactions, and the third one is also quite interesting, quite substantial, which is the New Zealand Maori cultures and the colonial history. So that would be quite, that was quite interesting. We wasn't able to sort of continue every year, but from time to time we have at least one lectures on that. The second one is very useful, practically useful sort of engagement of indigenous cultures and native titles. So it is about property law. It deals with these legal perspectives of it deals with core cases and implications in regard to land use, development process, environmental protections and sustainabilities, for that. And for the undergrad subjects, we also have a bit of sort of, I probably mentioned about the sophistication of value. So when we're talking about the perception of building and land's values, we probably need to engage this, historically and culturally, the indigenous land value and the concept of property in a way. What does it really mean? Which I clearly see is different from, have some different perspectives from the typical sort of market-based property value definitions. So I think it's the module basic covers quite a substantial breadth and depth. I believe it is an important source of this contextualized knowledge for for our colleagues at ABP to enjoy. I certainly learn a lot through this this module. Especially, I think I appreciate that cultural heritage part, from the perspective of this continuing history, or how to preserve that continuous history. Build it into teaching. I think eventually, I think that the students, once they come up, to practice in the industry, in the societies, they have to deal with this often very difficult sort of a judgment and the action about to deal with that interaction between cultural heritage and the current practice. And then to come out with a responsible solution. So it's lovely. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Hao. Thanks for your sharing of the different opportunities that the modules led you to find in the different knowledge areas for property. Yeah, thanks. And now I would like to invite Simon to share his perspectives on the module. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly, and thank you very much again, Dolly, for having me and giving me the opportunity to briefly reflect on the ICDC. Just to explain my background a little bit, as you can probably tell, having been born overseas before coming to Australia, not having really much knowledge of Australian history at all, to be honest. Coming here as it happened in the week that Kevin Rudd gave his apology to Australia's Indigenous peoples speech, arriving at a time where obviously where I guess the topic of Australian history, national identity, was particularly prevalent, and so it was kind of easy in a way to, after having arrived here, to pick that up, and I guess learning about Indigenous culture over the years. And I found personally for myself that happens a lot through media, naturally. I guess documentaries, you follow the newspapers and conversations online, museums, theatre plays, and all those sorts of things. But what I sometimes felt was, as far as I could tell, I couldn't quite find many opportunities to engage with Indigenous culture in my everyday life, or maybe I was just ignorant of those opportunities. So, which is why I think why the university's engagement around Indigenous knowledge is so important, because in that way, Indigenous knowledge, culture, history does become part of the fabric of my everyday life at work. And so, which is why things like the ICDC are I felt were so important to give me a better understanding of the manifestations and the history of Indigenous culture and knowledge. My background is probably a bit different to most of the other people today in that I'm not an academic. I don't have a curriculum that I can shape. I'm not a built professional, built industry, built environment industry professional. So I don't design myself. So the question for me was going into this module, and I was very interested in it, but I was wondering, okay, how does this impact my work ultimately? Are there any impacts that it would have on how I do my work? And apart from the fact, obviously, that it was an immensely well-designed module and really insightful, thankfully I found that yes, no, it certainly did impact the way I work. And to explain what I do, I look after alumni relations at the faculty. So in short, what I do a lot is, events, engagement with alumni. And my role is to, I guess, represent what's happening at the university in terms of its research and other activities, and to identify those initiatives that would be of interest to the alumni community and take them out there in the form of events or other engagement opportunities, and make people aware of it, essentially. And so there were several things that came out of the ICDC for me. Certainly around, particularly around the notion of, I think it was in module 3 where it was highlighted the, excuse me, the need for Indigenous agency and the respectful approach to talking about Indigenous art and design, and making sure it is not just a talking about, that it is actually a collaborative process. So if I want to design an engagement opportunity around Indigenous culture, it's not something that I can simply do on my own without I need to actually coordinate and collaborate with others on this, with others that are representatives of Indigenous culture, because I, as a non-Indigenous person, do not have the authority to simply go ahead and say, well, this is what I should do, this is what it needs to look like. I need to actually take a collaborative approach in these sorts of things. And I think that's where it then also leads into things like, as Jefa has mentioned, the sadly very low number of Indigenous students that we have, and the ICDC also mentioned the maybe even lower number of or percentage of Indigenous architects in Australia as a whole of the number of architects. And at the same time, Jefa, you've mentioned the number of events you're speaking at, and hopefully putting up these public events for our alumni, for the public at large, helps to broaden the notion that yes, that of the importance of Indigenous architecture and design, and hopefully then it inspires young people to actually, or young Indigenous people to consider studying, to enter the profession. And hopefully over time that will help us to build the proportion of Indigenous people who choose to go into architecture to design the environments that we live in every day. Two other things that came out of the ICDC for me were that obviously the increased understanding of the role of Indigenous culture and history in Australia, first and foremost, but our alumni cohorts span the globe, essentially, particularly in Southeast Asia. We have a lot of alumni, and obviously questions of Indigenous culture and national identity are relevant to those alumni cohorts as well in all those different countries. So understanding Indigenous history better in Australia also helps me in when I engage with our alumni cohorts overseas and trying to understand their motivations, their designs, and their history. And the third thing probably, and the third thing coming out of the ICDC for me was probably just a broader understanding, I guess, in a way of, I guess, design and art and buildings, if you want. Certainly around the notion of, for example, again, I think it was in module 3, that Western art, the way Western culture views art, is a lot around the outcome rather than the process, and there's a focus on the commodification of that art and how it looks in a museum afterwards. And stepping out of that kind of quite ubiquitous framework and thinking about it from different angle was something that was really insightful to me, and that I guess led into the view of I think one of the modules said that a successful building is a living artifact, and it is built around layers of shared communication and connections with people, rather than just something that stands there and has a function and it needs to last, ideally, that it is something else, that it is something a lot more living. I think having that understanding of the built environment was quite new to me. And so I think that has certainly helped me when I conceptualize and plan, events and engagement activities for alumni. Having that broader understanding of what the built environment can be has been immensely helpful.
Thank you. Thanks, Simon. And in the interest of time, may I ask Elaine to share? Thank you.
Okay, I did make some slides to help me think through this. I don't know whether this is overdoing it and whether we really have time, but I'm just going to leap right in, I suppose. So first, I want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people on whose lands I live and work, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future. And in fact, I was taken by how Paris commenced, because Paris also noted the lands on which she grew up. And for me, I grew up in the lands of the Noongar in Western Australia. I've been away from Australia for a number of years, returning to take up the role of the director of the Bachelor of Design at the close of 2019. And in that period of being away, and not visiting very often, there's a lot that seems to have happened in the Melbourne and Victorian context, a sort of an enlivening of consciousness, visiting cultural institutions, for instance, riding through to the botanical gardens. Suddenly, just these small signs such as Wominjeka, welcome. And so there's really signs to be optimistic of how we might together collaborate on continuing to learn together, I suppose. And out of the cultural competency module, I just wanted to sort of, I suppose, my way of grappling with it, and I have to say, I've put here competency, incompetency, because I really would have to acknowledge that I'm still feeling quite incompetent on my return to Australia. But nevertheless, I wanted to articulate this somehow in terms of a series of 6 lessons. So learning, of course, I think is a very crucial one, how we learn together. And I've seen amidst the student body a real thirst for being able to engage in Indigenous knowledges. We find this in our student forums. I found it in the one seminar that I've led so far at University of Melbourne, because my position means that I'm doing a lot of administration, but a real thirst for Indigenous knowledge, but of course the importance of issuing cautions as to how this is engaged with and whose permission needs to be sought. I also, years ago, when I was coming on board as one of the editorial committee members of Architectural Theory Review, which by now has quite a strong reputation, I was going back through the back issues of this important scholarly journal and realizing that in the first 2 editions, there were these important articles by Paul Memmott, which seems to suggest too where architectural discourse, which is the main place in which I'm operating, has been emerging historically in the Australian context. There was at least originally this attempt to grapple with notions of Indigenous modes of, production of shelter and circulation of signs and meanings and so forth. And I think it's interesting to reflect back on that. If one maps through to what happened subsequently with Architectural Theory Review, I do wonder whether we've held to the promise of these early editions, though, would be the question. I noticed that Jefa had an image out of Paul Memmott's really quite astonishing encyclopedic work on Aboriginal architecture of Australia. But these sorts of resources, one, goes to immediately, I suppose, coming from architecture and design. Then there's this question of seeing, I think. One thing that I did do returning to Australia was engage in this very popular work that I know is available to children too, Bruce Pascoe's Dark Emu. And Bruce Pascoe you know, we hear him speaking within the cultural competency module that Jeff has put together, and Bruce Pascoe draws on the work of Bill Gamage. And I think here, this question of seeing and what we don't see, what is before our eyes, and yet what we've rendered historically invisible, has struck me the most. So how do we see again? I noticed that there were these a couple of moments in the cultural competency module where we're being asked to kind of shift our perception, to recognize that there has been evidence right before us of these really complex modes of not only land use, but land care, and all the complexity of engagement with this place in which we find ourselves today. And further, in light of this, I thought that another thing that I'm always struck by in engaging in a very incompetent way with Indigenous knowledges is this issue of slowing down, that in fact the speeds by which we're required to undertake our work as academics, whether in teaching or research, tend to be moving at speeds that are sort of unsustainable. And here too is where I sort of intersect some of these learnings with other of the literature that I'm drawing on, that asks us to reorientate ourselves in light of an urgent need to rethink our environmental relations. And this also leads us to modes of working with these knowledges that we can collaborate on and learn from. And storying is obviously a big theme that comes through the cultural competency module, which is also something that in my own research is very important as a sort of methodological orientation. And here too, the work of the late Deborah Bird Rose has been really helpful for me in her engagements with country, and the sorts of responsibility around storying, because this is complex. And so she, in collaboration with Van Doren, talk about the intention is not to slip into the hubris of claiming to tell another's stories, but to develop and tell our own stories in ways that are open to other ways of constituting, of responding to, and in living, and in it, you know, working in a living and lively world. So the care also that's required in how we tell stories, whose stories we tell, and whose stories we do not have the right to tell, is something that I've been reflecting on quite a bit, and I think was also rendered very vivid in the cultural competency. Also, this question of witnessing, I've been grappling with recently. Again, Van Doren and Bird Rose talk about the arts of becoming witness, paying attention to others, and to standing as a witness and actively bearing witness, and all of which I think is sort of really crucial in this cooperation that I think we're all hoping to achieve. Also, I mean, part of the reason I'm bringing these thinkers into the story is I was really struck by the invitation offered in the cultural competency module to add to the list of possible resources yet more resources. And so, you know, I was thinking of some of the people I'm reading who helped me to grapple with questions of Indigenous knowledges, for instance. And I've been recently sort of paying a lot of attention to the tradition of scarred trees, or what the archaeologists call culturally modified trees. And I'm not going to go too far into this. We find them in strange contexts where we really have this sharp relief, you know, or contrast of relations to country that are now a butt against Western modes of occupation of the land. And thinking of what Hal was saying about how we also really need to think fundamental ideas around property and relations to environment. Images like this, I think, place such questions in stark relief. But amidst all of this, the final lesson for me, this one of caring and bringing in very much sort of feminist and intersectional ethics of care amidst all of this work. And just concluding, in fact, with this image of the tree school that recently took place at as part of the Monash University Museum of Art Tree Story exhibition, where a series of questions around Indigenous knowledge and how we pay attention and how we listen into each other's stories and how we pay our respects was sort of mobilised around this matter of concern that was a rescued scarred tree, and all the things that this image troubles us with, I think, or that draw to our attention. So these are just sort of my fleeting, I would have to say, you know, probably quite incompetent reflections. Yeah, but I really want to thank Jefa for, you know, giving us all this opportunity to be able to engage in this module, and really hoping that we can both share it beyond our faculty, because I know other faculties have been desperate to be able to engage in it too, as well as find the means of engaging this sort of module with our students, I think, who are really, really wanting to sort of be able to engage as well. Thanks for the invitation, Deli.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for sharing, Elaine. I think that was really powerful. Thanks, Simon, as well, for your insights on how you can use that in your own engagement activities. So may I now invite Jefa to provide a response? Thanks.
Yeah, no, it's terrific to hear the different insights and perspectives, and I think it's worth reiterating. Yes, this module was certainly designed to be, you know, accessed by, you know, professional staff, permanent staff, casual staff, newly minted staff, and there's certainly ongoing conversations around the potential to have a student-facing version as well. And I guess one of the important elements in terms of the whole proposition was this idea of it being bidirectional. And the reason being is that on speaking to all the various subject coordinators very early in the piece, there seemed to be a hesitancy and sort of a walking on cultural eggshells. And I guess one of the ways to sort of mediate that is to essentially say that everyone has a contribution. And if the starting premise that all projects built in the Australian context are built on Indigenous lands, and given that there are, you know, probably at best 20 graduates of schools of architecture in the country ever, everyone has a role to play. And to that end, I think this idea of having skin in the game and knowing that one needs to sort of calibrate one's own response by going on a learning journey, and that certainly all of us are on a spectrum across that learning journey. And so, and it's lifelong learning is certainly the case as well. So, you know, I undertake projects all around the country, and ultimately each project is distinct and different, and you learn so much from each of them. And in some respects, this idea of developing curiosity, having it bi-directional and encouraging people to contribute, drawing upon their own subject expertise is really important. And to open up a conversation and to ensure that people feel confident to contribute in, because, you know, certainly, yes, we're trying to acknowledge the fact that Western knowledge is not the font of all knowledge, that Indigenous knowledge can coexist, and there is great wisdom in, you know, 67,000 plus years of continuous connection to this place. What we're really wanting to do is build capacity, and in many respects, it's a pretext to analyse our own ethical and philosophical position and contribution and role within the profession. And certainly our role as educators to facilitate knowledge exchange certainly builds upon the sort of oral tradition of passing on knowledge. And I remember speaking to Uncle Max Dallamanaman Harrison, who's a UN elder, and he said something quite profound, which was, you've got to give it away to keep it. And what he was saying there was ultimately you have to pass on knowledge, otherwise it will be lost. There's certainly caveats in the context of Indigenous knowledge, that it's not something that can necessarily be hoovered up and claimed as your own or commodified. And there's certainly protocols and so forth. But it's important that that we open up a conversation and carve out the requisite time and space to have these conversations, because as has been said by a number, there is certainly that interest and appetite, and it's ultimately to the benefit of students, but hopefully also by building up our own sort of cultural intelligence, we have the skills and resources and confidence and capacities to start to engage with it. And knowing too that it's not seeking to supplement cultural awareness, which is a completely different domain, which is probably best orchestrated through directly with traditional owner groups who run their own courses, or through Murat Barak, or through the Indigenous Knowledge Institute, or through the Willan Centre. Within the university, there are countless mechanisms to engage with cultural awareness. It was very purposeful that we called it the Indigenous Cultural Design Competency. So it's the intersection between Indigenous culture and design, and how we build our own learning journey.
Okay, thank you very much for that response, Jefa. And we have gone over time, so my apologies, but I think the sharing and the messages, the insights that have been shared by everyone earlier are very helpful in our own, learning journey. And yeah, so thank you very much, Jefa, for coming and presenting, the backstory of the ICDC, and I guess helping us better understand the tool and what it is for, and also inspiring us to engage with, as a first step in the materials. And Elaine, thank you very much for that 6, lessons that you have shared. Very insightful, very useful, and some of them are also, mine, just reflecting on what you have shared. So thank you very much. Thank you also for the sharing of how Paris and Simon. Thank you all for your contributions. And yes, and for obviously for the audience for coming on board for share your time with us today. So thank you. And I'd like to leave everyone with the message that Jefa started with. If nothing of your culture, history, language, or art is visible, so I've written it down in the streets, parks, and buildings, and in ABP, in our own building, where we work, live, and recreate. How can you ever feel welcome in our own ABP? So thank you very much, and have a good afternoon, everyone.